Chequers this afternoon played host to yet another Brexit crisis meeting chaired by Theresa May. The cars pulled up, carrying cabinet ministers and Brexiteers. Around this table included the following: David Lidington, Michael Gove and Stephen Barclay, along with Chief Whip Julian Smith, and Eurosceptics Ian Duncan Smith, Boris Johnson, Jacob Rees-Mogg and Dominic Raab. If yesterday's million-plus march fell on deaf ears, today's papers cranked up the notion that the Prime Minister is running out of time, confidence and trust. The front pages talked of coups, cabinet revolts and suggestions for who would replace Theresa May within days. De facto Deputy Prime Minister David Lidington was one name.
I don't think that I've any wish to take over from the PM. I think he's doing a fantastic job. I tell you, there's one thing that working closely with the Prime Minister does is cure you completely of any lingering shred of ambition to want to do that task. I have an absolute admiration for the way she's going about it.
The Environment Secretary Michael Gove was another put forward.
I think this is a time for cool heads. What we absolutely need to do is to focus on the task in hand, and that's making sure that we get the maximum possible support for the Prime Minister and her deal.
Her deal remains the only deal on the table. Chequers is being described as an emergency meeting to try to overcome the insurmountables, whoever they are. But the Chancellor expressed gloom about the deal's prospects this coming week in the Commons.
I acknowledge that it's looking very difficult to bring together a majority for it. But that isn't enough for Parliament to say we won't vote for the Prime Minister's deal. Parliament is now going to be confronted with the time and the space to make its own decision.
Boris Johnson, without a seatbelt, was one of the first to arrive this afternoon, joined by top-down Ian Duncan Smith, who this morning appeared to offer some glimmer of hope.
All of this has to be balanced at the end of the day against what is really still on the table. Until we know whether they're going to bring it back, when they bring it back, it's impossible to say categorically what our position is, but I will recommend that colleagues should keep their counsel on this one.
Theresa May's recent meetings with rebels have failed to resolve their differences. Today's could very well be one of the last, if you believe those reports that suggest almost half her cabinet want her to resign as soon as possible.
Well, Hilary Benn is the chair of the Commons Select Committee on Brexit, and he joins us now. Mr Benn, no doubt you've been following the febrile atmosphere around the Tory leadership talk. Do you think a different Tory leader would change anything? Is Theresa May herself the blockage?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that the Prime Minister's leadership of the Conservative Party is in deep, deep trouble. But I'm more concerned about what this means for the nation, because we are facing not just a political, a constitutional and an economic crisis. The European Council last week gave us another 2 weeks, but we're still facing the risk of a no-deal Brexit in just under 3 weeks' time. And that's why it is essential, first of all, that we avoid that, because as the Chancellor said this morning, it would be catastrophic for the economy and for the country. And secondly, we need to get on with the task in Parliament this week of trying to see whether there is an alternative way forward which MPs are prepared to support. And that's why a group of us on a cross-party basis have put down an amendment for tomorrow to start doing that process on Wednesday of this week.
The problem with this, Mr Benn, is Parliament has had months to come up with a plan and hasn't been able to agree on anything. It may be the case that there is nothing that has a parliamentary majority.
Well, I think that's a bit unfair on Parliament, because the government, the Prime Minister, has the responsibility here. What they have failed to do ever since her deal was resoundingly rejected by 230 votes is to reach out across the House of Commons and see whether a consensus can be found on a way forward. Now, that's what the government should have done. To be honest, that's what the government should have done after the referendum result 2 3/4 years ago, but it has failed to do that. And that is why people describe it as Parliament taking control. I describe it as MPs doing their job, which is to try and find a way forward out of the crisis facing our country.
OK, I understand you now support a second referendum, or a confirmatory referendum, as it were. Why weren't you at the march yesterday?
Well, I got to the march, as it so happens, very late. I had constituency commitments in Leeds. But look, the most important thing we can do as parliamentarians is to vote for what we think is right. And I think, given the scale of the crisis, any deal that can be agreed by Parliament should now go back to the British people. If people want to vote again to leave, they can do so on the basis of a deal that has been negotiated with the European Union. And if that is rejected, however, then that would mean that we remain. I've been very struck over the last few weeks. The government keeps coming back to Parliament saying, change your mind about the Prime Minister's deal. And they say that's perfectly democratic to do that. But they regard going back to the British people to ask them whether they want to change their mind or not as somehow undemocratic. And I think it would be perfectly in keeping with democracy, given the scale of the choice we're making,
Mr.
given
Ben,
that we know a lot more about the real choices now.
Sorry to interrupt you, we are running out of time. Just very
2016.
quickly, you are talking about putting a deal back to the people. The problem is they may not be a majority in Parliament for any sort of deal, in which case we're going to end up with a general election. Is that what you think will happen? Well, that's down to the government. Of course I'd like a general election because I'd like a change of government. I'd like a Labour government in office. But if we don't try this week to see whether we can find something we agree on, well, I think Parliament would be rightly criticised. And that is why we hope our amendment will carry tomorrow. OK, we'll be watching very closely. Mr. Ben, thanks very much for joining us.